all. Welcome to today's session of Local Infrastructure Hub. As you're settling in, if you want to put your name, your role, and your city in the chat, that way it'll make it a more interactive session. And to the extent that your city has a port, if you could just indicate that as well in the chat response. We'll get started in just a minute to allow some folks to log in, get audio connected. Great. So we're gonna get started. Thanks for joining today. My name is Jamie Lavin, and I manage the Local Infrastructure Hub on behalf of Bloomberg Philanthropies. The Local Infrastructure Hub, for those of you who are new to us, is a national program, and it's designed to connect cities and towns with the resources and expert advice that you need to access federal infrastructure funding to drive local progress, improve your communities, and deliver results for your residents. We're proud to partner with the National League of Cities, the United States Conference of Mayors, Results for America, and Delivery Associates on the program. Today's session is focused on Clean Ports program. We know that there's millions of dollars available for ports to electrify, and it's a range of ports that are eligible for funding in this program: large ports, small ports, coastal ports, inland ports. So we want to make sure that all cities have the information that you need to be able to access funding out of this program, and then we connect you with the support. Go to the next slide. I want to remind everyone that you can find the recording, the slides, and information about future events on our program website, localinfrastructure.org. We'll also, under the resources categories, where we put our recordings and the slides. And as we continue to hear from experts like we're going to hear from today, and they generate resources or information or templates, we'll add those as well to our library bank so that you can have access to those. Go to the next slide. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by two port electrification experts. Will Marshall is the Freight Program Manager for the Electrification Coalition. He supports efforts to advance the electrification of the goods movement industry and other critical EV policies and programs. And Gerald Brito is a Program Associate with the Electrification Coalition's Freight Electrification Team. His work focuses on developing strategies for freight electrification at ports and advancing electric vehicle understanding through pilot project implementation. And importantly for cities on this call, in his past work, he has supported freight electrification at the Port of Oakland. Before we get to Will and Gerald, we'd love to get a pulse on your familiarity with the Clean Port program and where you are on port electrification. So we're going to launch a poll. If you want to fill that out while we'll get started, and the Zoom is yours, Will.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. So my name is Will Marshall, and Gerald and I are with the Electrification Coalition. If you're not familiar with our organization, the EC is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that develops and implements a broad set of strategies to facilitate the widespread adoption of electric vehicles to overcome the economic, public health, and national security challenges that stem from our dependence on oil. Gerald and I, as I mentioned, are part of our freight electrification team. So while the EC as a whole is focused on light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles, we are primarily focused on medium and heavy-duty vehicle electrification specific to the goods movement and freight industry. And looking at ports, with the frequent short to medium length trips made by medium and heavy-duty vehicles daily into and adjacent to the busiest ports across the country, electrification really offers a significant opportunity to improve operations and the environment in and around ports. With recent federal investments in the U.S. made by the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law for port electrification, this is a tremendous opportunity to start engaging with ports when it comes to port electrification projects. Next slide. So one of those investments and why we're here today is talking a little bit about the Clean Ports program. This is a new $3 billion program to support the adoption of zero-emission vehicles at ports. It was a program that was established by the Inflation Reduction Act. Earlier this year, on February 28th, the EPA released 2 notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs for short, and it funds 2 different competitions, and we'll dive into each one of those. So the first is the Zero Emission Technology Deployment Competition, and the other is the Climate and Air Quality Planning Competition. I also want to flag for folks that there's only one funding round for this program. So all $3 billion that has been allocated to this program will be awarded in these 2 NOFOs this year. Next slide, please. So in the NOFOs, the EPA has identified 3 programmatic priorities for applicants to address in their application. First is environmental justice in disadvantaged communities. This program is covered under the administration's Justice 40 initiative, which is to ensure 40% of benefits federal investments go to disadvantaged communities. Additionally, the program will prioritize projects that take place in or near communities impacted by air pollution, and that the EPA will evaluate applications on their ability to benefit disadvantaged communities experiencing poor air quality and the quality extent of that community engagement. The second programmatic priority is port transformation and pollution reduction. So the EPA is really looking to build a foundation for ports across the country to fully transition their operations to zero emission, while also reducing mobile source emissions that disproportionately impact nearby communities. And the last programmatic priority, and this was set forth by statute, is non-attainment. So the EPA plans to award a minimum of $750 million that was awarded to the Clean Ports program for projects that occur and take place in non-attainment areas. Next slide. So with that background, just want to talk a little bit about eligible applicants. The 4 key eligible applicants: 1 being port authorities, 2nd, state, regional, local, or tribal agencies with jurisdictions over a port authority or a port, air pollution control agency, or lastly, a private entity. However, for a private entity to apply, they must apply in partnership with one of the other 3 listed applicants, and they must also own, operate, or use equipment or technology. So need to accomplish both of those priorities. Next slide. So here are some of the notable dates that the EPA has identified. So as I mentioned, the NOFOs opened up in February 28th, setting off a 90-day window for applicants to submit their applications. On March 13th, the EPA held a webinar providing an overview of the Clean Ports program, similar to the webinar that we are offering you today. If you have any questions, after this meeting that we may not be able to answer, I strongly encourage you to check out the EPA's webinar, as well as some of the other webinars that they are conducting in response to the Clean Ports program, and that can be found on the Clean Ports program webpage on the EPA's website. On March 28th, there was an optional deadline for ports and other eligible applicants to submit to the EPA a notice of intent to apply. This is where eligible applicants had the option to share with the EPA the estimated cost of their requests from their application, as well as a short summary of their projects. Last week, the EPA held a joint webinar with the Department of Transportation's Marine Administration to discuss both the Clean Ports program as well as the Port Infrastructure Development Program, another grant program that is key for ports and can fund port electrification projects. And this is an open program as well, and that ports are focusing on. So you can see there's a lot of excitement and attention to ports right now. And then most recently, this past Monday, there was a deadline to submit comments to the EPA on their proposed waiver of Build America, Buy America requirements for this program. Gerald will be going into this a little bit more in the next couple of minutes. Looking ahead, the EPA will hold, excellent. Some upcoming dates. The EPA will hold another webinar next week on April 25th to go over some of the frequently asked questions that are listed on their website. And then probably the most important date to keep in mind is May 28th. This is the deadline for applicants to submit their application. Then the EPA expects to make notifications of selections in September of this year, with anticipated awards being made in December. Another date that has not been announced and is tied into the BABA waiver that has been proposed by the EPA, but the EPA will issue a final waiver of BABA requirements, so we're all eagerly awaiting that announcement. And with that, I will turn it over to Gerald to provide an overview of the Zero Emission Technology Deployment Competition.
Thanks, Will. So like Jamie mentioned, I'm Gerald Brito, Program Associate with the Freight Team at the Electrification Coalition. And now we're going to dive into really the bulk of the program, which is focused on the deployment of zero emission technologies at ports. Next slide. So this part of the competition is focus on, again, deploying that equipment and getting it on the ground. And so when we're talking about what equipment is eligible, when they say zero emissions equipment, this is limited to battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell technologies, as well as their supporting infrastructure. This language is defined in the Inflation Reduction Act and is also aligned with upcoming programs such as the Clean Heavy Duty Grant Program, which Will will mention later. So just to give you a sense of how the EPA is kind of tailoring their programs to reducing emissions. So unfortunately, that means that fuels such as renewable diesel and natural gas are not eligible for this program. So the three large buckets of project activities that are eligible are zero emission mobile equipment, the infrastructure to serve that mobile equipment, and then support activities to kind of tie it all together and make sure that deployment goes as smoothly as possible. Next, we'll go into a breakdown of the funding. Next slide, please. So this portion, like I said, is really the bulk of the program and will comprise 2.79 billion of it. And that will be going out to between 32 and 90 grants. And you can see here in this chart that the EPA is splitting these into 3 tiers. So Tier A is the largest of the projects. These are going to be 150 to 500 million each, with the highest cost share required. So 20% will be covered by the applicant, 80% will be covered by the EPA, and the smallest number of awards is expected to be in this category. In Tier B, these are smaller projects. You have projects between $10 and $149 million, smaller cost share, and they also anticipate more projects, up to 70 projects falling into this category. And then in Tier C, you can see there in brackets, it says tribal applicants only. So, this is to make sure that tribal applicants do have this carve out and are, included in this application. So they expect these projects to be between 2 and 50 million each, with 0 cost share. And you can see, they're anticipating between 2 and 10 awards here. And there are also other carve outs. One is they do consider dry ports to be part of this program. So in addition to seaports and inland water ports, dry ports are also included, these being these intermodal hubs where it's either truck to rail or rail to truck, and it's not the traditional seaport or river port that you might be thinking of. So there's a maximum of 250 million going to these dry ports, and there's also another carve out for small water ports. So there's a minimum, so at least 250 million will be given to the small water ports. Next slide, please. So just to quickly go over all the different types of equipment that will be eligible. So we have cargo handling equipment, including top picks, side picks, yard tractors, drayage trucks. So these are the usually Class 8 vehicles going in and out of ports, locomotives and rail car movers, and also hovercraft and other vessels, including tugboats and ferries. Next slide. So for the infrastructure serving this equipment, we have charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel infrastructure, battery storage, and shore power. I will note, so for the electric infrastructure, this is limited to assets that are behind the meter, so that being the customer side of the meter. And for hydrogen, that excludes generation, so you can have infrastructure distributing or dispensing hydrogen, but not generating it on site. Next slide. And for the support activities, this is kind of a catch-all for everything needed to make this all happen. So project-specific public engagement, workforce development and training, performance monitoring, project management and administrative costs, as well as all the different permits that will be required for getting this on the ground. Next slide. So there are certain requirements to kind of define that this equipment is used at port facilities. So we highlight some of it here. This is not an exhaustive list of requirements. So some of these requirements are, for example, for cargo handling equipment, 90% of the annual usage must occur at ports. For drayage trucks, they must visit the port at least 100 times per year. This third one here, so the equipment must be operated and maintained by humans. So unfortunately, autonomous vehicles or autonomous charging equipment is not allowed under this program. And also for infrastructure, it must be located on site or in close proximity to the port. This is except drayage trucks and locomotives, which have kind of a broader footprint. So they do allow for those to be outside of the port property itself. If you want more information on the other requirements, EPA has a Q&A document on the Clean Ports Program website that Jamie linked in the chat, and they update that document regularly. The last update was, I think, 2 days ago, so it's quite current. Just looking at an example budget for this program, we wanted to highlight this piece here where they are encouraging applicants to use no more than 50% of funds for a combination of infrastructure, that's excluding shore power, zero emission technology support activities, and project administration. So you can see here this example budget that we made where on the left-hand side, you have administration, workforce development, and charging infrastructure making up less than half of the pie. And on the right, you have trucks and cargo handling equipment, as well as shore power. And so the way it's written in the NOFO is that if you exceed this 50% threshold for the combination of funds on the left side, it's still eligible. You just may not receive full points in terms of the evaluation of the project. And speaking of evaluation, next slide. So here is how that criteria is broken down. So first off, we have project summary and approach. That is really the bulk of the evaluation. And then when it comes to demonstrating the environmental results, so what outcomes, outputs, and performance measures you lay out to be reducing your emissions at port facilities, that's 24 points. Programmatic capability and past performance, environmental justice and disadvantaged communities, like Will mentioned, is definitely a focus of the EPA on this program. They've been stressing this in every call, and as you can see here, it makes up more than 10% of the points. Project sustainability as well, job quality and equitable workforce development, and then project resilience to climate impact. And then the budget, like I mentioned, they're going to be looking at how you're portioning out these costs and thinking about the split between the deployment of the actual infrastructure itself or the equipment. And then next, I want to talk a little bit about the Build America, Buy America requirements for this grant. So next slide. So, this is something that we have heard a lot about at the EC. A lot of our partners are concerned about this. And the EPA did say that they were going to issue a waiver prior to the application deadline. So they did issue this proposed waiver on March 25th. And so it comes in two parts. The first part is a partial time-limited waiver of the 55% domestic content requirement. So they're waiving that. However, final assembly must still occur in the US. And secondly, they are proposing an additional de minimis waiver. So this means that 10% of the zero emissions equipment costs do not have to comply with any BABA requirements. And this stacks with the existing public interest de minimis waiver, where 5% of the total project costs don't have to comply with BABA requirements. So a full list of the eligible equipment is in the proposed waiver. So they specify equipment that will be covered under this proposed waiver. So please take a look at that to get more detail. And comments to the EPA, as Will mentioned, were due just this Monday. So, the EC, we submitted our comments, and a bunch of our different partners also submitted our comments, as this is a big concern for folks when considering their procurement processes. And we just want to make sure that the EPA releases the finalized waiver as soon as possible, so that folks can get their applications in line with the upcoming deadline of May 28th coming up soon. And with that, I will pass it back to Will to talk about the climate and air quality planning competition.
Great, thank you so much. So the second competition that was announced as part of the Clean Ports program, as Gerald mentioned, is the climate and air quality planning competition. Next slide, please. So just providing you an overview and also a funding breakdown, simply put, this competition will fund climate and air quality planning activities for ports across the US. These activities fall into 4 buckets, and we'll dive into each one of those types of activities in a moment and what they might include. But these is, this competition is a great opportunity for city involvement, and you'll see why soon. So those 4 activities include 1, emissions inventory and accounting exercise. The second, strategy analysis and goal setting. The third, stakeholder collaboration and communication. And then lastly, resilience planning. So this competition anticipates making 50 to 70 grants of up to $150 million in total. Per application, the federal funding request must be at least $200,000 and not to exceed $3 million. Additionally, at least 10 of these awards will be made to small water ports. Next slide, please. So looking at each of those different activities, program types that will be funded underneath this competition. The first planning activity, and this is the only one that of the 4 that is required to be submitted as part of an applicant's application for the planning competition. And so there are 2 main categories of exercises that the EPA provides as an example. And again, these are all examples of activities that as an applicant you can submit, and it's not limited to these. But first is mobile source inventory. This can include an inventory of port equipment, baseline emissions inventory, as well as projected future year business as usual emission inventory. The second element of that is data collection and processing, and this can include stakeholder interviews and surveys, vessel registry and traffic information, conducting a truck count or traffic study, as well as for emissions monitoring devices. Next slide. The second type of eligible project is strategy analysis and goal setting. And applicants are, while they're encouraged, they're not required to include this as part of their planning competition. So examples of the types of activities that the EPA includes for this activity include developing or updating a port emissions reductions goal or stakeholder engagement report, conducting a cost and feasibility analysis of emissions reduction strategies, doing a scenario analysis for the port, as well as identifying performance metrics to evaluate impacts of specific strategies. Next slide. The next type of eligible project type is stakeholder collaboration and communication. So the EPA, they really stress, and you can see in the evaluation criteria, both this competition as well as the zero emission technologies competition, that community engagement is a critical component and pillar for applications. So types of example activities that the EPA lists include creating and supporting a process to gather feedback from key stakeholders, offering trainings as well as resource capacity building to help stakeholders engage in port decision-making, conducting community needs or environmental justice assessments, and then as well as developing a community benefits agreement or plan. Next slide. And then the last eligible project type is resilience planning. As with the last two types of activities, these are, again, strongly encouraged as part of a eligible applicant's application, but again, it is not required. So types of activities that fall under this project type include developing an assessment of climate change vulnerabilities, identifying priority measures to protect port equipment, energy systems, and operations from climate vulnerabilities, identifying measures to protect near port communities from the impacts of climate change, and then lastly, to analyze scenarios of extreme weather impacts on ports and to ultimately develop action mitigation plans to mitigate those risks. So that was an overview of the Clean Ports program. Before we wrap up the presentation, I have a few more slides for you all, and we can dive into some Q&A. But talk a little bit about the opportunity that this program presents for cities if you're not already involved in this program or with your port already. So the Clean Ports program, this is an incredible opportunity for cities to learn more about their port operations. So there are kind of three recommendations, opportunities that we see from the Clean Ports program. So first is really to identify the key and build out your relationship and identify key port staff, as well as different internal or external stakeholders at the marine, rail, inland, or air operations. As Gerald mentioned, this program will fund both the seaports, the inland water ports, as well as those intermodal hubs. And so when it comes to those different stakeholders, it can be the port itself, but when it comes to electrification, there's going to be a lot of different key stakeholders that are going to be involved in making that transition, whether that's the drayage truck operators, the terminal operators for those ports that are landlord ports. And as we discussed, community engagement is another key component of this. So identifying those community groups that are involved in ports is going to be a critical component. So I strongly encourage you, building that relationship with the ports if you haven't already, as well as those different stakeholders. The second opportunity is to apply to the Clean Ports program. So as a lead applicant, local and regional agencies are eligible to be lead applicants, as I mentioned earlier, so long as they have jurisdiction over ports or port authorities. I will say, in full transparency, we are pretty far along in the process, in the application process, with the deadline coming up in a little over a month. So another great opportunity is, as a subrecipient or a partner. So partnering with your local port authority, or if your state or other local regional agencies, as well as air quality management districts are applying, reach out to them, see what they're doing as it relates to the Clean Ports program. And especially with the planning competitions, this is a really great opportunity for cities to get involved. And then the last opportunity and recommendation is just that by getting involved now and building those relationships with your local ports, other stakeholders, it's going to set you up for success moving forward. Because while the Clean Ports program, there's a lot of focus on it now, it's a new program. It's $3 billion dedicated for zero emission vehicles, looking at port electrification, as well as planning. However, there are more than, it's more than just the Clean Ports program, and I'll go over that shortly. So by building that relationship, you really, and developing those project ideas, you're setting yourself up success for different future funding opportunities. And like I mentioned, the Clean Ports program, it's all the money is going out the door this year. However, there are other federal opportunities. So next slide. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of different federal funding opportunities that are out there that have been made available by the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure when it comes to port electrification opportunities. And so these are some of the programs, just wanted to flag, and those funding amounts on the right-hand side, that is new funding that was made available, invested by the Inflation Reduction Act. as well as the bipartisan infrastructure law. So for some of those new programs, that is new funding. However, for programs like the Port Infrastructure Development Program and DERA, for example, that is supplemental funding to their already annually appropriated funding. So looking at those different programs, the Port Infrastructure Development Program, this is an existing program that is administered by the Marine Administration to improve the safety, efficiency, or reliability of the movement of goods into, out of, around, and within ports. This, like I mentioned earlier, this program's NOFO is actually open right now. It's closing on May 10th, so there's a lot of attention that ports are taking into different federal grant opportunities. And last fiscal year, the PIDP program did make significant investments into different port electrification projects across the country. So just another source of funding to support these types of projects. The next program is the Reduction of Truck Emissions at Port Facilities program. This is a new $400 million program administered by the Federal Highway Administration, ultimately to reduce truck idling and emissions at ports. And this also includes port electrification projects. We anticipate the first round of those awards to be announced very soon. I checked recently, haven't seen those awards yet, but it should be coming out soon. And then the next round of awards that NOFO will open up later this year. The next program that I just wanted to flag is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. This is one that you're all familiar with, and I know it's already closed, but I just wanted to flag this program as it did specifically highlights port electrification as one type of eligible project under that program. So again, just highly recommend to talk to your partners and other folks who might have applied to that program and see what they may have included as it relates to port electrification. And then the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, I think we're all very familiar with this program, but the EPA was awarded and had additional $60 million provided the EPA from the Inflation Reduction Act to fund grants, rebates that protect human health and improve air quality by reducing emissions from diesel engines. So it's just another avenue for ports, drayage operators, terminal operators to access funding to make that transition. And then lastly, the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles Program. This is a new $1 billion program to replace existing heavy duty vehicles with zero emission vehicles. We do anticipate that NOFO to be released very soon, most likely next week. We think the pre-NOFO notification went out earlier this week, so we're very excited to see that program when it goes live. So that wraps up our presentation, but we're happy to take questions from the audience. Oh, and then before I forget, the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen, that will take you to the EC's EV Funding Finder, so you can find more information about these programs as well as other funding programs for transportation electrification projects. Great. That wraps up our presentation.
Thank you so much, Will and Gerald. So much information here. I know there's a lot to unpack. Would love to open it up the floor to any questions. What we saw in the poll that we launched was that it looks like most of you are not currently working on an application. And so maybe we can just start with, if we have people on today who are not working on an application, where are there opportunities?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, if you're not working on an application right now, I think it just still makes sense to check in. If you're have a port nearby, check in with them, see what they're doing. If they're applying for this grant program, from what we've heard from ports, there's a ton of interest in this program. I think it's going to be a very competitive program. When we see the results of it, and just see what they're putting in their project, whether it's the zero emission technology competition or if it's the planning competition. I think there is still a role that cities can play, even if they're not a direct applicant or even a subrecipient. It's still going to affect your communities, and I think it's still worthy of knowing what those ports are doing, and then also just seeing how you can get engaged moving forward. Because like I mentioned, this is one program. It's a big program, but there are others that are out there.
Great. please add any questions you may have to the chat. I also wanted to mention that we're hosting a second session up on this opportunity that's going to speak quite specifically to the community engagement piece that Will and Gerald mentioned. It's also going to speak to the data that you're going to want to be able to pull to either plug into a port application or to know for your own application. And so just want to promote that. We'll share the registration link. Are there any other questions from our participants? One of the things we saw in the chat was mixed is whether you're already engaged in port electrification. It seemed like some of the folks are already engaged and some are not. I wonder, Lori from New Orleans, would you be willing to share a little bit about what you guys are doing in New Orleans? I know I didn't warn anyone you might get called on. It's like you're back in college, or in my case, when I went to law school and had to deal with the Socratic method. Great. Anyone else willing to share how they're working with their port on these types of issues? Okay. In that case, thank you, Will, and thank you, Gerald. I want to, may I go to the next slide? While we're talking about some of these upcoming sessions, we're going to launch a poll. If you would like some help navigating either filing an application or plugging into an existing application that your port might be preparing, or just figuring out how to engage with the port, please let us know in the poll, and we will connect you with more information. And so we have, like I said, next Wednesday, April 24th, we're going to do that deep dive into clean ports, and then on April 30th, we're going to be talking about how to partner with community-based organizations to advance environmental priorities and environmental justice, and that's really about your community and change grants that are out there from the EPA. Lots of focus on EPA programs right now. I feel like we go in a little bit of a cycle with transportation programs, then EPA programs, and broadband. And so really highly encourage everyone to log on for that. We're going to be hearing from cities who have been working really successfully to engage with their local communities. And then in May, we have May 14th, during Infrastructure Week, we'll be focusing on bridges and all the different types of grants that are out there, from small bridges, large bridges, and planning grants. And then our tech and innovation session is going to be focusing on micro-trenching and some of the lessons that communities have learned. Some cities have been able to use micro-trenching to successfully bring more competition in for their broadband providers like Mesa, Arizona. And I think there's some cautionary tales from our friends in Nashville and Louisville. So encourage you all, and we'll post links to register for all of those programs in the chat. I see that we have a hand raised from Desmond. Desmond, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I wanted to know how long the whole process takes from like the application to do we have to have a certain amount of support to get the funding, and also do we have someone that will help us walk through this process? Because I'm new to like grant writing, and so I just wanted to know like what would be the best way to get involved and get started with it.
Great. Will, want to take that one?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the deadline to apply to this program is May 28th. I know, some of the ports that we're talking to, there's a I want to say lengthy process of getting it, through the approval process, internally. So I know, we're starting to hear from a few ports that they're expecting to wrap up, just like bring together all the different components of their applications done by early May, just so that, again, I can run through run through the different internal processes. We're talking about, for some of these larger ports, there's a lot of approvals that are required. So that's one thing that we're hearing. And then again, notifications of selection will be in September, with awards anticipated being released in December.
And then in terms of support, you mentioned if you are partnering with any partner orgs, they do require letters of support, particularly for the those who are going to be subrecipients. So yeah, if you are planning on applying, I recommend firming up those partnerships as soon as possible.
And I just want to say,
thank you.
It's probably also a good time. If we go to the next slide, Manny. Thank you. We're one back. There we go. We have boot camps for those of you who aren't familiar yet. In partnership with the National League of Cities, the Local Infrastructure Hub offers grant application assistance boot camps. And so what those are really about is helping you from soup to nuts on all the elements that it takes to be able to file a competitive grant. We are currently registering for our next round of boot camps. These boot camps, the way that they work is we have sort of a teaching module where experts like the Electrification Coalition come in and talk about the specific grant opportunity and teach you about the elements that you would need to include in your grant application. And then we have experts like Tracy Kalunga from the Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation who talk about community engagement and how you make sure that that shows up in your application. We talk about how you pull compelling data to support your application. What does a budget look like, and how do you think about the match funding requirements? And so we are currently registering for our next round of boot camps, which will be covering the Brownfields program, the Bridge Investment Program that's running through October, the Combined Rail Crossing and Elimination, and CRISTI for short, program, the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhood program, which we just saw really big awards come out of last month, and the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling Grant Program that we hosted a session in February and heard just about really innovative projects that are happening all over the country on composting and recycling and repurpose and reuse to make a circular economy. So Chris has posted in the chat the link to be able to register for the boot camps. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. The registration closes in May, and we'll start our classes May 20th. Thank you all so much for joining us today. The recording and the materials we posted on our program website. And please join us next week for our second installment of Clean Ports. And I hope that you all have a nice day. Thank you.
Thanks.